Okay, let's unpack this. We're digging deep today into, well, a corner of history that sits right where ancient texts meet modern scholarship.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
Imagine taking claims from thousands of years ago, claims that have, shaped entire cultures, and looking at them not just through faith, but using the same tools historians use for any ancient event.
That's exactly the approach, critical historical analysis.
And that's the mission today. Our focus is on something often called a minimal fact.
Right, and that term minimal fact, it's important. It doesn't mean the fact is small or insignificant, not at all.
No, definitely not.
It means it's a specific claim about Jesus of Nazareth or his immediate aftermath that's just so strongly supported by the historical evidence, using those standard critical methods, that, well, a really broad range of scholars accept it.
And that includes people who might be pretty skeptical about other things in the Gospels.
Absolutely. Skeptics, agnostics, scholars from different faith backgrounds, or none at all. It's about finding that common ground based purely on what the historical analysis shows.
And specifically today, we're zeroing in on minimal fact 2 from the research material we've been poring over. And this particular claim is that after Jesus died by crucifixion, his closest followers, the disciples, they had real experiences that they, at the very least, genuinely believed were literal appearances of Jesus risen from the dead.
That's the core claim we're exploring today. And just to be clear, every insight, all the data we're going to talk about, it's drawn directly from the detailed examination of evidence around those experiences.
All right, all based on the academic research in the source material we're using.
Exactly. We're sticking to the data and the scholarly arguments presented there, not bringing in outside stuff.
So our goal, what we want you, the listener, to take away from this deep dive, is to really understand why this specific claim that the disciples had these experiences, they were convinced were resurrection appearances. Why is it considered historically strong? Strong enough for such a wide range of scholars, including critics.
Yeah, we want to pull out those key nuggets of knowledge, give you a shortcut maybe to being properly informed on this one really crucial historical point, seeing the academic foundation under it.
It's about understanding the historical case itself.
Precisely. Not about proving a theological outcome, but about understanding the evidence that leads historians to this specific conclusion about what the earliest followers believed and experienced.
Okay, so let's lay out the central claim itself. The absolute heart of the New Testament message, really in our focus, it's the assertion that Jesus was raised from the dead and then appeared to his followers.
And importantly, the earliest sources don't present this as just, a vague theological idea. They frame it as something rooted in specific events witnessed by specific people.
Right. And this minimal facts argument isolates that historical component.
Yes. It says, Jesus' disciples had real experiences that they, in fact, believed were literal appearances of the risen Jesus after his crucifixion. That's the historical kernel we can assess.
Independent of theology, just looking at the historical data for that claim.
Exactly.
And the source material really hammers home how significant this particular fact is in historical Jesus studies. It ranks incredibly high.
It does. Think about the core things historians often agree on about Jesus, his message about the kingdom of God, the fact he was crucified under Pilate.
Yeah, those are pretty standard.
Well, this claim that his disciples believed they saw him alive afterwards, many critical scholars consider it just as historically certain, maybe even more so than almost any other detail about his life or death.
That's kind of stunning when you first hear it, isn't it?
It really is. It highlights the strength of the evidence for the belief and the experience itself, not necessarily for the resurrection event, but for the disciples' conviction.
So the sources, they say eyewitnesses saw him die, saw him buried.
Right. Death and interment are part of the narrative, but then the appearances are this separate set of claims, and the reports are quite specific.
They claim he was seen often, not just once.
Yes, often, and in lots of different settings. Private encounters, one-on-one, but also public appearances to groups, big groups sometimes.
Indoors, outdoors, day, maybe night.
All mentioned. And by different kinds of people, men, women, which, as you said, is significant given the culture. We'll get into that.
And critically, some who reportedly saw him were apparently unbelievers before, or at least doubters, like his own brother James or Paul.
That's a key point. And some sources even add details that seem to point towards, well, a more tangible, almost physical reality to the experiences.
Like being touched or eating food.
Exactly. Details like that are embedded in the narratives describing these encounters. They're not just presented as purely spiritual visions in every account.
So based on the data in the source, the core historical question we're really tackling when we boil it down is pretty direct, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's after his death and burial, was Jesus actually seen again by his followers in a way that convinced them he was alive?
And studying the evidence around their experiences, their claims, their conviction, that's the path the sources take to approach that question historically.
Right. It shifts the focus slightly. From proving the resurrection itself, maybe, to establishing the historical reality of the disciples' profound conviction, a conviction they explicitly attributed to seeing the risen Jesus.
Okay, so where does the evidence start? One of the most powerful lines the source material highlights comes from identifying these early pre-Pauline traditions. Creeds, maybe hymns, confessions.
Yes, this sounds a bit technical, but it's incredibly important historically. Think of them like snapshots. Snapshots of the absolute earliest Christian message.
Before the New Testament books were even written down.
Exactly. These were circulating orally, often in a short, maybe formulaic reports or statements of belief. Scholars identify them using linguistic clues, their structure. Sometimes Paul himself says, I received this, indicating its older tradition.
So they're like windows into the very first beliefs.
Pretty much. Windows into the core doctrines, maybe bits of sermons, things used in worship or teaching in those very first years, literally giving us a glimpse of the earliest church's preaching and practice.
And the key value here is how old they are.
Precisely. Their exceptional earliness. The source stresses this. Many critical scholars date these traditions to within the first decade after the crucifixion.
Wow, a decade. That's fast for ancient history.
It is, and some are potentially even earlier, maybe circulating within just 1 to 3 years of Jesus' death.
1 to 3 years.
That's what many critical scholars think, and this is recognized across the board, even by skeptics. And the value, it puts us historically so close to the events they describe. It's like finding a news report written the day after something happened, not just relying on histories written 30 or 40 years later.
And the prime example, the one everyone points to, is in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, verses 3 to 7.
Absolutely. 1 Corinthians 15.3 to 7. This is often seen as ground zero for studying these early traditions. Paul even introduces it by saying, he handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received.
That word received is key, isn't it?
Yeah, it's huge. It's technical language. It echoes how Jewish rabbis talked about passing down authoritative tradition. Paul is explicitly saying, this isn't my idea, this is the core stuff I was given.
And the content he says he received is, well, it's fundamental.
It is. That Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. That's the core event sequence. But then he immediately continues.
And that he appeared to Cephas Peter, then to the 12.
Right. Then it goes on. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles.
That's a specific list of appearances. Peter, the main group, a huge crowd, James, his brother, then the apostles again.
Exactly. It's presented as a core, non-negotiable part of the gospel Paul got. A structured, detailed list of claimed encounters with the risen Jesus, embedded in what scholars agree is an exceptionally early creedal formula. It gives names, groups, even mentions that most of the 500 are still around to potentially verify it when Paul was writing.
And the source mentions other early traditions too, right? Not just this one.
Oh, yeah. There are other snippets, like in Luke 24, verse 34, where the disciples suddenly exclaim, "The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon Peter." That sounds like an earlier report being quoted.
Okay.
Then you have the sermon summaries in the book of Acts, chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 13, 17. Scholars argue these often reflect the gist of early apostolic preaching, maybe even based on Aramaic originals. And guess what they consistently emphasize?
The resurrection and appearances.
Bingo. And then other Creole-sounding bits, like in Romans 1 or Philippians 2, which talk about Jesus' death and subsequent exaltation, implying the resurrection. The key point is the widespread scholarly agreement that these kinds of traditions existed very, very early.
So the claim of appearances wasn't something tacked on decades later. It was there from the start.
That's what the evidence from these early traditions strongly suggests. It was central, foundational, right out of the gate. These traditions are the first crucial piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so we have these incredibly early traditions, these snapshots of belief from potentially within months or years. But to give them real historical punch, especially the appearance claims, you need to link them back to the actual people involved, right? The supposed eyewitnesses.
Absolutely. A tradition is one thing, but connecting it to its source is crucial for historical validation. And this is where Paul's own story, his own writings, become absolutely vital, as the source material emphasizes.
How so?
Well, the argument is that these earliest creeds, like 1 Corinthians 15, they didn't just, materialize out of thin air. The most likely place they originated was within those core, influential Jewish Christian circles back in Jerusalem.
From the apostles themselves.
Precisely. From the very individuals who claim to be the eyewitnesses, Peter, James, John, the others. And Paul provides the bridge.
Because he tells us he met them in his letter to the Galatians.
Exactly. Galatians is key here. Paul gives us a timeline. He says his own conversion, which, remember, he also attributed to seeing the risen Jesus, as he says later in 1 Corinthians 15:8.
Right. Last of all, he appeared also to me.
Yes. He dates that conversion experience about 2 to 3 years after the crucifixion, so roughly 32, 33 AD. Still very early days.
Okay.
Then Galatians 1 tells us 3 years after his conversion, so now we're around 35 or 36 AD, maybe just 5 or 6 years after the crucifixion.
Still remarkably early.
Incredibly early. Paul makes his first trip up to Jerusalem specifically, he says, to get acquainted with Peter, Cephas. And he stays with Peter for 15 days. He also mentions seeing James, Jesus' brother, during that visit.
15 days with Peter.
And the specific Greek word Paul uses here is fascinating, according to the scholars cited in the source. He says he went to historicity kaphen.
Historicity. What does that mean?
Well, it's not the common word for just visit or see. Classical Greek historians, like Herodotus, use historiosai to mean conducting an inquiry, an investigation, specifically to get information or knowledge.
So like historical research.
That's how many scholars interpret it. It implies Paul went with a purpose to gather reliable information from Peter, the key figure.
So definitely not just a social call then. Not just popping in for tea.
Highly unlikely, given the context and the word choice. Remember why Paul is writing Galatians. His whole letter is defending the authenticity of his gospel message, which he says at the start is all about Jesus' death and resurrection.
Right. He's arguing his gospel came directly from God, but also that it lines up with the original apostles.
Exactly. So he goes to Jerusalem, meets the leader, Peter, and Jesus' brother, James, using a word that suggests investigation, stays for 2 weeks. What on earth would they have talked about for 15 days?
It probably wasn't the weather.
Chuckles. Almost certainly not. Given Paul's mission, his need for apostolic agreement, the core of the gospel message, it's almost inconceivable that the central events, the death, the burial, and especially the claimed resurrection appearances, wouldn't have been a primary topic.
He needed to know the story from the source.
He needed to get the foundational information straight from the key claimed eyewitnesses, and this leads directly to the scholarly consensus.
That Paul likely received the core content of that 1 Corinthians 15 creed. Maybe not the exact final wording, but the list of appearances and the core facts from Peter and James during that meeting.
Yes, this is very widely accepted, even by highly skeptical scholars. The source quotes Bart Ehrman again here. He calls this visit one of the most likely places where Paul learned all the received traditions that he refers to.
Wow.
And then Ehrman asks, rhetorically, about Paul getting this info from Peter and James. Can we get any closer to an eyewitness report than this?
That's a powerful statement from a critic.
It really underscores the historical significance. Paul, just a few years after the events, spending 2 weeks investigating with Peter, the primary witness named in the creed, and James, the former skeptic brother. Even if the creed wasn't perfectly formed yet, the crucial facts about the death, burial, resurrection, and appearances were almost certainly discussed and learned then, directly from these early sources.
So that connects the early creed directly back to the claimed eyewitnesses via Paul's explicit testimony about his inquiry.
It provides that crucial link, a direct trace back, using Paul's own account and specific language indicating historical fact-finding. It's a powerful piece of the historical case.
But Paul went back to Jerusalem again later, didn't he, the Galatians 2 visit?
He did. 14 years after that first visit, as he says in Galatians 2. So it's still relatively early, maybe around 48, 50 AD. This time, the purpose was slightly different.
What was it this time?
He went up with Barnabas and Titus, and this time he met with the recognized pillars of the Jerusalem church, Peter, James, and now also John. And he says he went specifically to lay out the gospel message he had been preaching to the Gentiles.
Why? To get their approval?
Essentially, yes. To make sure they were all on the same page. He says he presented it to them privately, lest somehow I should be running or had run in vain. He wanted confirmation that his message was consistent with theirs.
And what was the outcome of that meeting?
It was hugely significant. Paul reports that Peter, James, and John added nothing to his gospel. They didn't correct him, didn't say he was missing anything crucial.
They accepted his message as valid.
They did. They recognized his mission to the Gentiles, Paul says, and gave him and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, signifying agreement and partnership.
So this demonstrates that the key leaders, Paul working with Gentiles, Peter, James, and John, primarily with Jews, were all proclaiming the same core gospel.
Exactly, which included, as we know from Paul, the resurrection appearances as foundational. Paul himself sums it up right after the Creed in 1 Corinthians 15:11. Whether then it was I or they, the Jerusalem apostles, so we preach and so you believed.
Unified testimony.
A convergence of testimony from all the major players, confirming that the central message about the resurrection appearances originated with and was agreed upon by the earliest claimed eyewitnesses.
Yeah.
It solidifies the historical argument for where these claims came from.
So putting that together,
Yeah.
we have incredibly early traditions, maybe just years or months after the crucifixion, claiming appearances. And we have Paul explicitly stating he investigated these claims with Peter and James very early on, and later confirming his message matched theirs and John's. That seems like a strong foundation.
It provides a direct historical line from the earliest recorded beliefs right back to the individuals who claim to have been there. It's a crucial starting point for the historical case.
Okay, so now let's move beyond those early traditions and the apostolic connections. The source material then brings in another set of tools, standard tools historians use, the historical criteria.
Right. These are like principles or tests that historians apply to ancient texts to try and figure out how likely it is that an event described actually happened, or that a saying attributed to someone is authentic.
And applying these to the New Testament claims about the disciples' experiences gives us, more layers of evidence?
Exactly. Independent lines of reasoning that can support or challenge the claims based on historical methodology used for studying any ancient source. And one of the big ones is the criterion of multiple attestation from independent sources.
So what's the principle there?
It's pretty foundational in history. If you find a claim, an event, saying reported in several different sources, and importantly, those sources are independent of each other, meaning they didn't just copy from one another or from a single lost source.
Then it's more likely to be historical.
Much more likely, yes. It suggests the information wasn't just one person's invention or a rumor in one small group, but something known and reported more widely in different streams of tradition.
So how does this play out with the resurrection appearance claims?
Well, the source argues it applies very strongly here. It lists a whole range of sources, both inside the New Testament and outside it, that seem to independently refer to or describe Jesus' resurrection and the appearances.
Let's break that down. Inside the New Testament first.
Okay, within the canon, we have several distinct lines that function as independent sources. First, there's Paul's personal testimony, his direct claim to have seen the risen Lord himself. Like in 1 Corinthians 9:1, have I not seen Jesus our Lord? And 1 Corinthians 15:8, last of all, he appeared also to me. Critical scholars see this as extremely strong evidence that Paul had an experience he was utterly convinced was seeing the risen Jesus.
Even the Skeptical Jesus Seminar gives that high marks.
They rate Paul's testimony as virtually certain, their highest category. That's significant. Second, you have the 1 Corinthians 15.3-7 creed we just discussed. That's distinct from Paul's personal claim. It's a tradition he received about appearances to others. So that's source number 2. Second, you have the 1 Corinthians 15. Third, the sermon summaries in Acts, chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 13, 17. As we said, scholars like Dodd argued these preserve the essence of early preaching, maybe from Aramaic roots separate from the Gospels, and they hammer the resurrection appearances theme. That's arguably a third stream. Fourth, the synoptic Gospels, Matthew and Luke, specifically have appearance narratives. Matthew 28, women at the tomb, the group on the mountain in Galilee, Luke 24, the famous Emmaus Road story, the group in Jerusalem where he eats, the ascension. These are detailed, distinct narratives.
Different stories, different details.
Exactly, suggesting independent traditions behind them. Fifth, John's Gospel. Chapters 20 and 21 offer completely separate appearance accounts. Mary Magdalene alone, the disciples without Thomas, then with Thomas, the doubting Thomas scene, then the group fishing in Galilee, again, unique stories. Fifth, John's Gospel. Chapters 20 and 21 offer completely separate appearance accounts. Sixth, you could even point to other New Testament writings like Hebrews, 1 Peter, Revelation. They don't always narrate appearances, but they're built on the bedrock assumption of the resurrection and exaltation, which implies it.
Okay, so even just within the standard New Testament, you've got Paul's testimony, the early creed, Acts summaries, Matthew, Luke, John. That's at least 5 or 6 distinct lines of reporting on appearances.
Right. It's not just one author making this claim, it's multiply attested within the canon itself, but it doesn't stop there. The attestation continues outside the New Testament.
In other early writings.
Yes, in non-canonical sources written within roughly a century or so of the crucifixion, the source lists several key ones. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, his famous passage about Jesus, the Testimonium Flavianum, is complicated because parts were clearly added later by Christians. But a wide consensus of scholars, including skeptics, believes the original passage likely mentioned that Jesus' followers claimed he appeared to them alive again after his crucifixion.
Coming from Josephus, a non-Christian, that's huge.
It's incredibly significant enemy attestation, if you will. Then you have the Apostolic Fathers writers like Clement of Rome around 95 AD, Ignatius of Antioch around 107 AD, Polycarp around 110 AD. They constantly refer to the resurrection as foundational. Ignatius even talks about the disciples touching the risen Jesus to prove he wasn't a ghost, echoing Luke and John, but maybe drawing on separate tradition.
So the generation right after the apostles is still emphasizing this.
Absolutely. Then there's the B-Doc, an early church manual around 100 AD. It just assumes the resurrection is known fact. The Gospel of Peter, a non-canonical fragment from maybe the late 1st or early 2nd century, is a very different, dramatic story of Jesus exiting the tomb, witnessed by guards and elders.
Another independent strand.
Seems like it. The Gospel of the Hebrews, known from fragments, specifically mentions an appearance to James, Jesus' brother, at a meal. That corroborates the mention of James in the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, but from a different source.
Okay.
And even the Gospel of Thomas, which is mostly sayings, refers to the living Jesus, which many scholars take as implying the post-resurrection Jesus.
Wow, okay. That's a lot of sources.
It really is. The source emphasizes the cumulative force here. You're looking at potentially 24 or more distinct texts or traditions, canonical, non-canonical, maybe even Josephus, all referring to the resurrection and appearances within about 100 years of the events.
That level of multiple independent attestation for any event in ancient history would be considered strong, wouldn't it?
Very strong. It makes it historically difficult to dismiss the claim and the belief as a late invention or something confined to one small group. It was clearly widespread and reported through many different channels very early on.
And the source also mentioned that specific types of appearances are multiply attested.
Yes, that strengthens it further. Group appearances, for instance. Seeing the risen Jesus as a group is reported in Matthew, Luke, John, the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, and maybe Acts summaries.
Not just one person's vision.
Right. And group sightings are harder to explain away psychologically as just hallucinations. Even critics like the Jesus Seminar or Crossan acknowledge multiple sources attest to appearances to the main group of disciples, the 11 or 12, and the Emmaus disciples.
It's one individual appearances.
Also, multiply attested for key figures. Paul's experience, his letters and Acts, Peter's appearance, 1 Corinthians 15 creed and Luke 24, James's appearance, 1 Corinthians 15 and the Gospel of the Hebrews, Mary Magdalene's, Matthew, John, and the longer ending of Mark. Again, the fact these aren't just mentioned once adds weight.
So the sheer number and independence of sources covering both group and individual appearances forms a major pillar for the historical claim that the disciples believed this happened.
Absolutely. It's a convergence of data points. And related to this is the criterion of multiple literary forms. The claims about appearances don't just show up in one type of writing, like only in narrative gospels. They appear in creeds, like 1 Cor 15, in historical narrative, Acts, in personal letters, Paul's, in gospels, narrative, dialogue, possibly reflected in apocalyptic revelation or wisdom literature, Thomas.
So the story wasn't just told one way.
Right. Its presence across different genres suggests it permeated different parts of the early Christian tradition and wasn't confined to a single literary stream, another layer of independence.
Okay, the next criterion is one that often really hits home because it feels psychologically true. The criterion of embarrassment.
Yes, this one is fascinating and quite powerful. The logic is simple. If writers who are trying to promote their cause, trying to convince people, include details that are awkward, counterproductive, or downright embarrassing for their heroes or their message,
They probably wouldn't have invented those embarrassing details.
exactly. Why would you make up something that makes you look bad or makes your story harder to believe? The thinking is, if such embarrassing details are included, it strongly suggests they were part of the actual historical tradition. The writers included them, perhaps reluctantly, because they were too well known or too important to the story to omit, even if they were awkward.
So if the New Testament writers were just crafting propaganda, they'd have smoothed over the rough edges, made everyone look heroic.
That's the argument. And the source points to a lot of details around Jesus' death and the disciples' reaction that are incredibly embarrassing if you're trying to invent a triumphant narrative.
Like what? For Jesus himself first.
His agony in Gethsemane, seemingly wanting to avoid the cross. His cry from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? That sounds like despair. And the crucifixion itself, a degrading, cursed death. Hugely shameful in that world. Not the end you'd invent for a divine hero.
And what about the disciples? The supposed stars of the post-resurrection show.
Oh, this is where it gets really pointed, directly relating to the appearance context. The source lists multiple examples. All the male disciples, except maybe John, reportedly fled when Jesus was arrested. Total abandonment. Peter, the designated leader, the Rock, vehemently denies even knowing Jesus 3 times. A total failure of loyalty. The guys seem mostly absent at the crucifixion and burial. It's the women who stick by him and handle the burial rites.
That doesn't paint the future leaders in a very good light.
Not at all. And then, crucially, regarding the empty tomb, which sets the stage for the appearances, who discovers it first?
The women.
The women, and this is a huge point for the criterion of embarrassment and thus for the tomb's historicity. Why? Because in first century Jewish and Roman culture, women's testimony wasn't considered legally reliable. It carried little weight.
So if you're making up the story,
you would not make women your primary first witnesses. It weakens your case in that cultural context. You'd have Peter and John find the empty tomb first. The fact that all the Gospels report the women were first, despite this cultural liability, strongly suggests it happened that way. They reported the tradition as it was known, even though it was potentially embarrassing or less legally convincing at the time.
Okay, that's the strong point about the tomb. Does the embarrassment extend to the actual appearance accounts too?
Oh, absolutely. This is critical for our minimal fact about the disciples' experiences. The source highlights several deeply embarrassing details after the tomb is found. Jesus' own brothers, like James, didn't believe in him during his lifetime. They were skeptics. Their later conversion, attributed to an appearance, comes from a place of prior embarrassment for the family. When the women come back from the tomb saying it's empty and angels said he's risen, what do the apostles do?
They don't believe them.
Right. Luke says they dismiss the women's report as leros, idle talk, nonsense, garbage. This is the reaction of the future leaders of the church to the first news of the resurrection. Hugely embarrassing.
You wouldn't invent that.
Seems unlikely, and in some accounts, like the longer ending of Mark, the disciples then disbelieve other disciples who claim to have seen Jesus later. They remain skeptical. And even when Jesus does show up to them, the accounts often include him rebuking them. For their unbelief, their hardness of heart, their refusal to believe the earlier witnesses. Imagine writing a story where your risen Lord's first words to his main followers are basically chewing them out for not believing.
Doesn't sound like good PR.
Not at all. And Luke's account of the appearance in Jerusalem, they're terrified, think he's a ghost, doubt him even while he's standing there until he physically eats food in front of them. And of course, there's Thomas demanding physical proof, needing to touch the wounds before he'll accept it.
So the recurring theme is just doubt, skepticism, fear among the very people who are supposed to be the primary witnesses.
That's the core insight from the criterion of embarrassment here. If you were inventing the story to be persuasive, why fill it with examples of your key witnesses being doubtful, fearful, hard-hearted, and needing extraordinary proof? It runs completely counter to propaganda.
It makes them look unreliable almost.
Exactly. The argument is that this pervasive theme of doubt and disbelief is historically authentic because it's so counterintuitive. These embarrassing details were likely part of the received tradition, too well known to ignore, reflecting the actual complex, confusing human reactions to these extraordinary claimed events. The writers included them because that's how it was remembered.
That is a really compelling line of argument. What about the next one, the criterion of dissimilarity?
Okay, this one is sometimes called double dissimilarity. The idea here is that a saying or event attributed to Jesus is more likely authentic if it's unlike what you'd expect from the Judaism of his time, and also unlike the later developments and characteristic beliefs of the early church itself.
So it has to be unique, not fitting neatly into either the before or the after.
Right. It helps isolate what might be distinctively original to Jesus or the very earliest moments.
How might this apply to the appearances?
Well, the source suggests it's maybe a bit more debated or less direct for the appearances themselves compared to, say, some of Jesus's teachings. But you could argue certain aspects fit. The whole concept of a suffering, crucified Messiah who then reappears, that was certainly dissimilar to many dominant Jewish messianic hopes at the time, as scholars like Ehrman note.
That seems clear.
And perhaps the specific nature of the described appearances, not just a disembodied spirit, not just a glorious ascension, but these sometimes puzzling encounters involving recognition issues, doubt, touching, eating, maybe that specific kind of post-resurrection manifestation, could be argued as dissimilar from both standard Jewish resurrection concepts and perhaps some later, more purely theological Christian formulations. But the source acknowledges this is more complex and debated for the appearances.
Okay, so a potential, but maybe less central criterion here. What about Aramaic wording or Semitisms?
This one looks for traces of Jesus's original language, Aramaic or Hebrew ways of thinking, Semitisms, preserved within the Greek New Testament texts. Since Jesus and his first followers spoke Aramaic, finding these linguistic fossils can point to very early traditions, close to the original source.
Like Jesus' words on the cross.
Exactly. Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. That's Aramaic preserved in Mark's Greek text.
So any examples related to the appearances?
The source mentions a couple of possibilities. Mary Magdalene's cry in John 20.1 when she recognizes Jesus. Rabune, that's an Aramaic or Hebrew term for my teacher or my master. Many scholars see that as likely preserving her actual original exclamation, suggesting an early tradition behind John's narrative.
Okay, that's specific.
There's also the ongoing scholarly debate about whether the 1 Corinthians 15 creed might have originally circulated in Aramaic before Paul got it in Greek. The source says that's kind of a stalemate, hard to prove either way. But perhaps more significantly, some of those Acts summaries we mentioned, the ones proclaiming the death and resurrection scholars like C.H. Dodd, argued strongly, based on their Greek phrasing, that they look like direct translations from Aramaic originals.
So the core message, including appearances, was being preached in Aramaic very early.
That's the implication. It suggests the foundational resurrection proclamation was happening in the language of Jesus and the first disciples, right there in the earliest Jerusalem community.
Got it. And the last criterion mentioned is enemy attestation.
Right. This one looks for corroboration, even indirect, from sources that were hostile, critical, or just neutral towards the Christian movement. If your opponents concede something, it tends to carry extra weight historically.
Are there examples related to the appearance claims?
The source mentions a few possibilities, but handles them cautiously. One is that story in Matthew about the guards at the tomb. Matthew says the Jewish authorities asked Pilate for guards because they worried the disciples might steal the body and fake a resurrection. Then Matthew has the guards witness something dramatic, get paid off, and spread the story that the disciples stole the body.
Most scholars doubt the details of that story.
Yes, skepticism about the guards actually witnessing something supernatural and the bribery plot is high. However, the source notes that the request for guards itself might reflect a historical reality or at least a plausible concern from the authorities' perspective. If they were worried about the tomb and a potential resurrection claim, it indirectly supports the idea that Jesus was buried and there was something about the tomb situation, like it becoming empty, that needed explaining, which in turn provides context for the appearance claims. But again, it's indirect and debated.
Okay. What else?
Acts 6.7 mentions that very early on, a large number of the priests became obedient to the faith. Priests were often linked to the Sadducees, who denied resurrection, and were part of the establishment opposed to Jesus. While the text doesn't explicitly say they converted because they saw the risen Jesus, their conversion happened right when intense resurrection preaching was the central message. Their shift from opposition could be seen as indirect enemy attestation to the power of that message.
Plausible, maybe.
But the strongest examples of enemy or skeptic attestation are probably James and Paul themselves.
Because they started out opposed or unbelieving.
Exactly. James, Jesus' own brother, was a skeptic during Jesus' ministry. Paul was actively persecuting the first Christians. Both underwent radical transformations, becoming key leaders in the movement, and both attributed their conversion directly to an encounter they believed was with the risen Jesus, mentioned for James in 1 Corinthians 15.7, central to Paul's story in Acts and Galatians. Their 180-degree turns, coming from places of opposition or skepticism, are powerful historical testimony to the profound, life-changing conviction generated by these claimed experiences.
So these historical criteria, multiple attestation, multiple forms, embarrassment, maybe dissimilarity, Semitisms, enemy attestation, they all converge.
They provide multiple independent lines of reasoning using standard historical methods that support the core claim. The disciples had experiences they were convinced were appearances of the risen Jesus. They don't necessarily prove what the experience was in objective terms, but they build a very strong historical case for the reality of the disciples' experience and the resulting unshakable conviction.
Okay, so given all of that, the super early traditions, Paul's investigation connecting them to Peter and James, and now all these historical criteria pointing the same way, what's the bottom line? What's the scholarly consensus on this minimal fact today?
This is really where the source material lands with significant force. It states there's a widespread scholarly consensus, and this cuts right across the theological spectrum that includes many skeptical, agnostic, non-Christian historians, that the disciples did have experiences, real experiences, experiences that utterly convinced them that they were seeing Jesus alive again after his crucifixion.
That consensus itself is pretty remarkable, isn't it, across such different viewpoints?
It's highly significant. It means that when historians, regardless of their personal beliefs, apply their standard methods to the available evidence, they arrive at this common conclusion about the disciples' experience and belief. The source backs this up by quoting several prominent scholars.
You mentioned Bart Ehrman earlier, a leading non-Christian critical scholar. What does he say?
The source quotes Ehrman very directly. He says about the disciples claiming Jesus appeared to them soon after his death, convincing them he was raised. This is a historical fact. He repeats elsewhere that they certainly had real experiences that they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus. He accepts the historical reality of their experience and conviction, even if he personally explains it naturally, perhaps as grief-induced visions.
What about the Jesus Seminar? They're known for being pretty far on the skeptical end.
Right. And yet, as cited in the source, while they doubt many gospel details, they explicitly accept the reality of the disciples' claimed experiences based on the data. They rate Paul's experience as virtually certain, Peter's and Mary Magdalene's as probably reliable. They might call them visionary experiences, but they don't deny the historical reality that the disciples had these experiences and believed they were appearances.
And John Dominic Crossan, another major critical voice.
He's quoted saying, quite forcefully, "I am convinced as a fact that they had apparitions. How you explain that is a separate issue, but it happened. They are not making it up. It's not hallucinations." Again, notice the distinction. He accepts the historical fact of the experiences, apparitions, while leaving the explanation open. That mirrors the core consensus on the fact of the experience and belief.
So this isn't just one school of thought agreeing. It really spans the critical spectrum.
Definitely. And the source points out this isn't even a new development. It goes back. Even 19th century critics like David Friedrich Strauss admitted the apostles themselves had the conviction that they had seen the risen Jesus. Figures like Baur, Schleiermacher acknowledged the early belief. Even Rudolf Bultmann, the giant of 20th century skepticism, conceded. All that historical criticism can establish is the fact that the first disciples came to believe in the resurrection.
So for well over a century, critical scholars have generally agreed that the earliest followers believed this based on experiences they had.
Yes. The consensus on the historical reality of the belief and the claimed experience is robust and long-standing. It testifies to how compelling the historical evidence is specifically for that point, regardless of one's stance on the supernatural.
And the source even mentions some scholars who, perhaps starting from a critical position, have been pushed by the evidence even further.
Yes, that's an interesting development noted. Some scholars looking hard at this data have moved beyond just saying they believe they saw him to suggesting that actual appearances, in some real objective sense, likely occurred. People like E.P. Sanders or Dale Allison Jr. are mentioned.
Dale Allison, what does he say?
The source quotes Allison stating quite plainly, "I am sure that the disciples saw Jesus after his death." That's a significant statement from a major historian, indicating the evidence for the experiences is so strong it pushes some scholars towards affirming the appearances themselves, not just the belief in them.
Okay, so let's try to pull all these different threads together now. The source talks about a cumulative case. It's not just one argument.
Exactly. That's how historical arguments usually work best. Not a single smoking gun, but multiple independent lines of evidence all pointing in the same direction. Like strands in a rope, each adds strength. The source actually tallies it up, saying the case draws on 13 major arguments plus a greater number of subsidiary facts, reaching about 36 considerations, all supporting this minimal fact.
36? That's a lot, pointing one way. Can we recap the strongest ones we've covered?
Sure. The source highlights these as particularly powerful. 1. Paul's direct eyewitness testimony, seen as rock solid by critics. 2, those super early pre-Pauline creeds and Acts summaries, especially 1 Corinthians 15, dating incredibly close to the events. 3, Paul's involvement receiving and transmitting this core message. 4, Paul's first Jerusalem trip, that historicity, the investigation with Peter and James. 5, Paul's second trip, confirming agreement with Peter, James, and John, apostolic unity on the message. 6, the fact that many appearances were to groups, harder to explain away, multiply attested. 7, the sheer volume of multiple attestation overall, maybe 20-24 sources within 100 years, canonical and non-canonical. 8, the variety of literary forms the claims appear in. 9, the criterion of embarrassment, especially the disciples' pervasive doubt and the women witnesses, that's huge. 10, maybe the criterion of dissimilarity for the suffering Messiah concept. 11, traces of Aramaic pointing to early origins. 12, enemy or skeptic attestation, James and Paul's conversions being prime examples. 13, and though we didn't dive deep into it today, the evidence for the empty tomb, which strongly complements and provides context for the appearance claims, makes a powerful combination.
So it's not like one dim flashlight beam. It's more like a whole array of spotlights hitting the same spot from different angles.
That's a great analogy, all illuminating the same historical conclusion. The earliest followers had experiences that utterly convinced them they had encountered the risen Jesus.
The convergence is key.
And that exceptional earliness of the core message, the homologia, possibly just months or a couple of years after the crucifixion, that kind of rapid, widespread attestation for such a transformative claim is, as some scholars cited say, pretty much without parallel in ancient history for a figure like this.
And you can't really separate this from the impact it had on them, can you?
No, that's part of the historical picture too. The radical transformation is undeniable. From a frightened, scattered group after the crucifixion to bold proclaimers willing to face persecution, suffering, and death. That doesn't prove the resurrection, of course, but it powerfully testifies to the depth and reality of the conviction that stemmed from those experiences they claimed to have had. They clearly believed it with everything they had.
The source material just touches on one final point, sort of beyond the historical evidence itself.
Right. It just notes that while our focus, and the focus of much historical scholarship, is on establishing the reality of the disciples' experiences and belief, the original Christian message wasn't just presenting facts. It was always tied to a call for response.
A call to faith and commitment.
Exactly. The historical claims about who Jesus was, his death, his resurrection appearances were the foundation, but they were presented as the basis for a call to total life transformation and trust.
Well, this has been a really thorough deep dive into Minimal Fact 2. We've really unpacked the historical case for why scholars accept that Jesus' earliest disciples had experiences that convinced them they'd seen the risen Jesus.
Yeah, we looked at the bedrock of those early traditions, traced that crucial link back to Peter and James through Paul's own investigation.
And then layered on all those historical criteria, multiple attestation, embarrassment being particularly strong.
Right. Understanding that academic basis, seeing the why behind the scholarly consensus, is crucial. It shows why this claim carries so much weight in historical studies, even among critics.
It really gives you, the listener, that insight into the data and the arguments behind the conclusion. It's not just asserting it, it's showing the foundation.
It moves the discussion onto the ground of historical evidence and analysis.
So let's wrap up with a final thought for you to chew on, something to ponder based on everything we've explored. If the historical evidence is compelling enough to lead such a broad range of scholars, including deep skeptics, to agree on this historical fact that the first witnesses had real experiences that profoundly convinced them they'd seen Jesus alive again.
If that historical fact is established.
What does that imply about the nature of those experiences themselves? What questions does this widely accepted historical conclusion about the disciples' conviction raise for your own understanding of what might have happened?
History establishes the effect, the conviction, the transformation, the movement launched. It strongly points to a cause, these experiences. The historical analysis might stop there, but the question lingers. What exactly was that cause?
A question worth thinking about.
And
keep exploring.
Keep asking questions.
Until next time.